We've got about 15 or 20 minutes to pick up some questions, including inviting anybody online to post some questions if they wish, which I can put to the panel. But first of all, I'd like to go to the room here and see whether anyone would like to pick up on any of the issues they've heard from the panel or make an observation around this topic, a question or a topic. Now, there are some roving microphones. If you can use the microphone, please, so that people online can hear. So there's a mic coming to you from behind. Could you perhaps say who you are?
Women for Justice and Peace in Sri Lanka. Nobody speaks about the destruction of the environment of the oppressed by oppressive governments around the world. And I come from Sri Lanka and the north. I am a Tamil. Soon they will be extinct, and they won't have a land to stand on. Okay. The second one, there is no such thing as growth. There's only change. From a natural scientist's point of view, things change in such a way that some people can use them. Some of the changes result in the production of useful products and useless products. And from a social scientist's point of view, some changes are benefit to people, some people, and some changes don't benefit others and oppress them and deprive them of whatever they could get without the presence of the oppressors.
Okay, thank you. I'll take a couple of questions and we'll pick up Catherine.
Yes, it's an observation, not a question. It's.
Do you want to say who you are, Catherine?
Yeah, sorry, Catherine Cameron from the Smith School at Oxford.
Use the mic, is it?
Yeah, from the Smith School. It's an observation following from James Cameron's point about distributed power and your observation about data and knowledge networks and what the banks are doing. Don Tapscott gave a really interesting speech at the RSA the other day talking on exactly this topic, where he identified 12 different ways in which we are changing power networks and the infrastructure of knowledge and access, and how in many ways these networks are bigger than nation states, bigger than multinationals, and enabling enormous change. So if the MDBs and the Institute are looking into this some more, then I recommend that as another source. Really fascinating piece of work. Thank you.
Great. A couple more comments before we turn to the panel. Anything? Karen, way down
here. Thank you. I'm Karen Ellis. I lead the Private Sector and Markets Programme here at ODI, and am very much involved in the green growth work streams that Sheila's been talking about. I just wanted to mention two things first, then a question. One is that we've been doing a project on low-carbon competitiveness as well, which very much looks at and analyses the issues that Mr. Cameron talked about, resource scarcity, new sort of sources of comparative and competitive advantage arising from technological innovation, etc., and how that might impact on low-income countries in particular. And we have a working paper coming out on that today, hopefully, on the website, and there's a public meeting on Monday about that as well at lunchtime, in case you're interested. And we have another project, and there's a paper outside looking at lesson learning from China and India on policies to promote private sector investment in green innovation and green technologies. And that's really trying to identify case studies of where policy has really created strong incentives for the private sector or business generally to get engaged in those kinds of investments. And that my question relates to that, which is, I mean, what does the panel see as the most important things for governments to do to get the private sector to respond to these changes, global changes that are going on, climate change, resource scarcity, etc. Obviously, removing fossil fuel subsidies is a key one for those countries that have them, and setting out a clear policy framework. But there's all sorts of difficult challenges around incentivising private sector and choosing the right technologies and whether to provide subsidies or advanced market commitments, etc. So there's lots of difficult choices to be made. So any comments on that would also be very welcome. Thank you.
Andrew, let's take one more down this end, and then we'll turn to the panel. Just a request to those online, if they have any questions, to post them, please.
Thank you. Andrew Shepherd from ODI, from the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network. So I guess you can imagine what I'm going to kind of thing that I'm going to ask you. There wasn't much content in any of what the speaker said about who was excluded and who was included. This is a straightforward question to you, if you have any comments on that. We've heard from Jason about the need for a transformational approach in relation to green growth. And I wonder whether there's a similar need for a transformational approach in relation to inclusion. It's possible that cash transfers provide part of that transformational approach, and they have tremendous potential, particularly in terms of bringing the poorest people up to more or less the national poverty line, if you like, so helping the people right at the bottom. But Brazil's experience, for example, indicates that cash transfers, which can have many very beneficial long-term effects into the labor market and so on, need to be embedded in a much wider range of social programs. And I mean, I think there's a fashion now for learning from Brazil in Asia. I'm wondering whether that will lead to a similar transformational approach there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There's some great questions, and quite a lot around the issue of inclusion and who benefits and who's the growth for. Alex, I might just turn to you, since your name was somewhere associated with the World Bank Inclusive Green Growth Report. I mean, tell us a little bit about how far you think the evidence is around who benefits and who's in and who's out, as Andrew puts it.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that many of the poorest in communities are those who suffer most from environmental degradation. So I take the point that the lady here raised right at the beginning. And I look at this from the point of view of an economist. A lot of these environmental problems have to do with what we call in the jargon externalities. When you have these environmental externalities, it's very difficult to find a way through individual action to identify and solve the problem. And why is this important? Well, basically, I think for a lot of governments, they simply haven't received, if you like, the signals from ordinary people, and particularly from the poor, about the value of the environment to the poor. So I think finding ways to give a voice to those who are suffering from environmental degradation and understanding better what forms that degradation takes are both very important. Air pollution is a very good example of this, because even local air pollution, let alone greenhouse gas emissions, may be very difficult for individuals to perceive, and even when they do perceive them, it's very difficult for small groups of people to do anything about it. It has to be dealt with at a urban or regional or national level. And so a lot of this is to do with giving voice to people and enabling them to collaborate more effectively. And I wanted to say that first, because I think that's perhaps even more important than the recommendation from agencies like the World Bank that environmental pricing and the public finance that results from that can be used to help cushion the impact of energy pricing. So it's really a case of finding mechanisms like cash transfers, perhaps, like ensuring access to energy that can be used to balance the need to price environmental damage.
Dr. Kawe, do you recognise this appeal for a transformation of the agenda to look at the social inclusion dimensions, or is that not on the agenda from where you sit?
Well, I think the basic thinking, I agree that the basic thinking has to be changed in the key areas, including green growth and inclusive growth. And the policies that could be taken should be supportive of not only green growth and inclusive growth. I fully agree with Jason's point. Combination of green growth and inclusive growth, maybe integration of the two would be extremely important. And I am an economist, so I also agree with the combination of pricing and public sector support for the disadvantaged should go together, and from that matter, developing a very credible, targeted cash transfer system, which seems to be, supported by many people here in this room. I think that's a very, very important challenge, because fundamentally it's a challenge of building capacity on the part of the government to identify who should be supported, and to make sure that the supported person gets the money. And building that system has been a big challenge for many countries, because money leaks out during the process. So I think it's very important for developing countries and also people like us to think about the most efficient ways of achieving that. Raise, I think, a fundamental way of one of the fundamental ways of addressing the environmental issue would be to put the right price on carbon and resources, and consumers have to pay. Consumers have to pay for the right price. And then at the same time, the poor and disadvantaged should be protected. So this combination is really the way to go.
Thank you. I don't think we should press a button on James about the right price of carbon at this moment, but you might want to comment on some of the other issues that emerged in those questions. Catherine's observations and Karen's as well.
Yeah, really briefly, because there's so many good points in those questions. One, on the knowledge networks, I'm investing a huge amount of belief in this. I realise there's a lot to learn about how these networks might evolve. They won't be entirely benign. Any power shift will encourage all sorts of abuses as well, right? So one has to really pay attention to what this technology can do. But the mere fact that there's a huge innovative surge taking place around the base infrastructure of knowledge networks, and a lot of that innovation is taking place in the so-called emerging economies. One only has to go and visit the creativity taking place in Nairobi's software groups to see what they can do to build apps that will make it will answer. And I'm surprised you didn't hear more references to the inclusion argument, because I see this as being absolutely an aspect, a substantive contribution to inclusion, including for those who are currently disenfranchised and excluded from processes of decision making, and access to a mobile phone powered by a solar panel on a rooftop in a rural Kenyan village is the kind of inclusion that green growth and inclusiveness offers. The second point is that I happen to believe that will connect. It will facilitate some of the justice conflicts that were raised in the first question. It won't be a solution in itself, but ways in which people can organize themselves, including against oppressive power, against the power of the state or the corporation. The facility to do that through communications technology exists. and can be made relatively inexpensive for those who are currently disenfranchised. The competitiveness issue is critical, and I think we're going to get to a point where we will completely redefine what competitiveness means, because the current model is clearly inadequate. It's extremely difficult to move away from it. I know from having fought and lost many battles in the World Economic Forum on this issue, but the fact that the current model does not include any value for resource depletion, no value for any of the externalities associated that cause real pressure on public finance, you know, for example, on public health. Air pollution in Beijing was the example mentioned earlier. That's a factor in competitiveness without any doubt at all, but it's not included in the current definition, and nor is there any value associated with long-term investment, because the competitiveness dogma, I think it's fair to say, is a current account snapshot that can only look back. It can only refer to investments that have already been made and analyze now in a comparative way, in ways that sometimes have nothing to do with the real-life competitiveness, attractiveness of an economy. And final point is that when you combine these two elements, increased capacity to think differently and include different people in decision-making with a different model for competitiveness, you're well on the way to achieving the green growth transformation. That is, in essence, an intellectual challenge followed by a way to challenge how governments organize their economic behaviors, insofar as they can be the drivers and generators of economic growth, which of course they can only in part.
James, thank you very much. Time's short. Very, very short couple of comments from the floor, please, if there are any. Yes, thank you. Is there a microphone? Yes, two comments, and then we must stop and start down there.
Alan Lovell. I run an anaerobic digestion business, and so I was very supportive of the distributed power comments. And wrong continent, forgive me, but a colleague of mine is talking to the government of Tanzania about putting just rather under 1% of the land area in Tanzania down to maize, and you could feed a lot of people. You could produce the entire power requirements at the moment of Tanzania, and you'd be left with the woody material being used for a substantial amount of charcoal. Add to that the vastly reduced cost of PV, and between the two, you have a real opportunity in the tropical areas to power the developing, the poor areas of the world in an economical way, which is a fantastic sign of hope.
Okay, thank you for that. It's optimistic. Yes, this gentleman here.
Johannes Schumann, PwC. Thank you very much to all of you for the very interesting information you gave about especially policy instruments, which I found very interesting. To my opinion, one of the major problems is that all of these policy instruments are hugely distorted by corruption and not free markets. This, to my opinion, is one of the major problems. And my question, if I have the possibility to raise one short question, is what policy instrument, to your mind, might be effective to work in the circumstances of huge corruption and not free markets?
Okay, that's a very specific, substantial. One sentence, please. Yes, because I just go ahead.
Thank you.
One voice.
Thanks. Dave Steinbeck from Ricardo AEA. I just wanted to ask Sheila about subsidy reform in fossil fuels, and thinking about the Nigerian case last year, where you could argue that sort of a network of people were sort of creating a reactive approach to sort of against green growth, and how you can sort of strategize around empowering people to think in the longer term in terms of equity, but when they might not actually have the ability to think in the longer term.
Okay, great. So I will stop there and just go quickly down the panel and wish to respond to any of this. Sheila, you had a specific question.
I'm happy to answer that question first, and it sort of links to this question of political economy. I know, Alex, you mentioned this, so maybe that's something you could pick up afterwards. In terms of subsidy reform, I think and this links to the question of data. I mean, I think what has been found to be the most critical component is this disclosure of information, is sharing information about the implications of existing subsidies. So there's been work that's been done by the Global Subsidies Initiative on Citizens Guide to Subsidies, and I think what took place in the case, there's been work already done around comparing what happened in the case of Iran to the case of Nigeria, where in Nigeria there wasn't, from my understanding, significant communication of information in the lead up to the proposed reforms. There wasn't a social protection system put in place, whereas in the case of Iran there were bank accounts created for direct cash transfers, and those transfers were made to, my understanding is about 80% of the population, because you actually see it's not just the poorest that are affected, but quite significantly all the way up through the middle classes that are affected by subsidy reform. So I think there's starting to be lesson learning around what can be done to both provide the information that's necessary, so you're empowering people, but you're also creating a kind of broader social protection network. I think also what's found in the case of the protests that take place in the case of subsidy reform is that it's often actually more, not the poorest who are protesting, but actually more sort of more educated sort of students, and maybe even sort of farmers collectives or trade unions. So people who are actually fairly empowered are the ones who are protesting, not to say that they're protesting for the wrong reasons, but it's not necessarily the poorest and most affected who are even empowered to protest. So I agree about these points about the amount of information that can be disseminated. I don't know if you want to speak to the kind of these
Well, it's a big topic, so I just wanted to say two things. First, I think that there are advantages to very simple, pervasive instruments. So it's easy to see what the instrument is and whether it's being used. So carbon pricing is better than having loads and loads of subsidies tailored to particular industries. And this is a problem in developed countries as much as developing countries. The second thing is giving people a stake in reform. And I think part of the problem in Nigeria is people feel they've been ripped off by the oil sector. You see it in the UK with wind power. If people don't have a stake in things, then they're going to stand in the way. But there are ways of giving people a stake in things. This is clear in all the work on RED, for instance, with forest management.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Dr. Cohen. Just a couple, very quick, we need to wrap up, so just a closing couple of comments, please.
Just say about fuel subsidy and also food subsidy. They are there because of the fundamental lack of social protection programs for the poor. It's a very easy way to implement, so many countries do have fuel, food, and other subsidies. In the case of Indonesia, such subsidy is bigger than investment, infrastructure investment budget, which is crazy. So that's one comment. Another comment on subsidy for green growth, like subsidizing solar, energy, and subsidizing other green industry is good, but the actual practice is that at a country basis, those subsidies are given to domestic farms often, almost all the time. So subsidies are used as sort of as industrial policy. And such subsidies would be good, but a much better approach would be to give subsidies to all farms, whether domestic or foreign. So trying to avoid the use of subsidy for green growth for domestic industrial policy is an important way. Yeah. Just finally, the regulatory measures to say contain carbon emissions and so forth that's resisted by the vested interest in many countries. So, I think that's going to be a big challenge, in particular in countries like China, because SOEs, don't like that, and there is really a substantial need to address that. It's a political issue.
If I may allow us to end on that note, I think that's an excellent point to end. Jason James, excuse me not giving you the microphone. We need to stop, but it's great to have economists to my left and right talking about the social and stakeholder management and the political dimension. So I think we have gone over the last hour and a half forward on this agenda as CDKN, and I suspect as ODI and I suspect as GGGI. These are all agendas that really matter to us. And I think it's fairly early on, this whole agenda about green growth and inclusive green growth, and we've got a lot of work to do. But I think this discussion, which has been helpfully triggered by the visit of Dr. Kawai and his colleague to London, has been great. Thank you very much to you, sir, and the panellists for joining us this morning. And please, if you can hang around and stay for patisseries and coffee, do so. But thank you very much to the panel.